Good morning to those here in person and those online, and welcome to our panel on industry, government, community, and research partnerships. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we are on today, the Wurundjeri people and those lands that you are located on today online, and acknowledge that Indigenous Australians have been custodians of the lands and waterways of Australia for thousands of years. I acknowledge and respect the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the country's first scientists with deep and enduring knowledge of the land, waters, and skies, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I welcome all First Nations people here today. This morning's panel will examine how archaeological science, an inherently inter- and multidisciplinary field that intersects the natural and physical sciences, cultures, arts, and social sciences. Practitioners are in universities, museums, consultancies, government, cultural institutions, and a diversity of many other roles. This panel brings together experts in their sector in an interactive discussion about the role of archaeological science and where they see the future of the discipline, especially looking at collaborative partnerships. The panel consists of experts from a diversity of areas. Jeremy Smith is a principal archaeologist at Heritage Victoria and has published widely on the subject of the state's historical archaeology with the focus on the archaeology of Melbourne. Ian Travers is the Chief Executive Officer of Extent Heritage and has developed and led several large groundbreaking cultural heritage studies involving diverse clients, multidisciplinary teams, and numerous community stakeholders in the areas of archaeology, cultural values assessment, and heritage management. Dr. Caroline Spry, Senior Heritage Advisor and archaeologist at Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung Cultural Heritage Aboriginal Corporation, where for the corporation, she manages Aboriginal cultural heritage in a large swath of Greater Melbourne and has research interests in lithics, culturally modified trees, rock art, oral history, and traditional cultural knowledge. Louise Murray is the research manager of the First Peoples Collection strategy within Strategy of Culture here at the University of Melbourne, where she is responsible for managing research and planning to support the establishment of a program of research and scholarly engagement with the collections, giving priority to and use of to access the collections by First Peoples, and in particular, communities of origin and traditional owners. It's really fabulous to have such a variety of people involved in archaeological science and to hear their views today. I'm Rachel Bukalka-Filkoff, and I will moderate this discussion. We will start with some questions for each panelist to respond to, and then open up to participants here in person and online for more questions and discussions. So again, welcome everyone, and we'll start with our first question. So what I'd like to do is start with the question and then have each of the panelists respond, starting with the first panelist. So the first question is, what does archaeological science mean to your sector, and how can university researchers better share our expertise with you and build more accessible and productive relationships? And for that, I'd like to start with you.
Can you hear me? All right, so what does archaeological science mean to our sector? So I'm the CEO of Extent Heritage, so we're a heritage consultancy. We do largely compliance work, so complying with statutory legislation in built heritage, historical archaeology, Aboriginal cultural heritage, interpretation. Archaeological science is just a vital way for us to enrich the data that we're using to assess cultural heritage and to provide or to inform management recommendations for that cultural heritage. But I suppose one of the challenges, just to sort of, get this discussion going from a consultancy point of view, is that we are largely in satisfying the legislation and achieving compliance. We are meeting conditions or requirements of management plans, which are set for us within a regulatory framework. So to some extent, it depends on the amount of research and archaeological science that regulatory framework requires. And also we're doing this within the context of development-led, often privately funded investigations. And so the challenge for us is to try and achieve the resourcing which is necessary to be able to bring in archaeological science into that process. Obviously, well, not obviously, but it is a competitive field. And unless there are very clear prescriptions that are made for these things, it can be a challenge to try and get those things in and still be able to do the work, it effectively to win the jobs.
So it sounds like a balance between science and business.
It is.
And regulation.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. That's the point. That's what this seat represents, the challenge of meeting those two things.
Yeah. So maybe I'll hand it over to Jeremy.
Thanks, Rachel. And I think probably a good follow on from Ian, and my role really is a regulatory role. So when works, particularly in the historical or maritime archaeological space, when those works take place, the Heritage Act requires approvals to be issued. Now, we set conditions on those approvals. So the thing about the archaeological science, the growth in the field, I'm seeing opportunities and efficiencies developing in that space, that things can now be done more efficiently than they were done previously. And we have the opportunity to investigate, to learn, to interrogate through these scientific methods that have never existed before. So there are great benefits in the consultancy space, in the regulatory space, that the new developing technologies can offer. But that nexus, the framework about how do we require these things to be done within the conditions of an approval is something that we're putting our mind to now. We're already seeing through collaborations, through almost more informal relationships and methods, we're seeing really significant findings coming to light, which really shows that new forms of interrogation have got very, very valuable outputs. So we're at a point now where we're needing to refine the model to move from these phases of interrogation being optional to put them within a regulatory framework, so that when Ian's team tender for a project, they understand that they are going to be required to follow up on some aspects of their site investigation where detailed analysis might be required that we wouldn't have done 5 years ago. So I think one of the challenges we've got is recognising the great potential that these new fields of investigation offer, but trying to make them less informal, less optional, to try to tie them into a regulatory framework. But the case studies that we've got, the 4 or 5 examples over the last 2 or 3 years, where we've achieved really significant outcomes without regulatory support, shows that the model exists for really significant outcomes and findings to be made. So it's how we refine that model and really kick this industry into something more substantial within the regulatory framework.
It's really great to hear that archaeological science is really taking on a more formalized position within the regulatory frameworks. I'm sure many people are already doing it, but also that you say that there is greater efficiencies in that process, but I'm sure also expanding technologies also drive that. So what are some of the key, because archaeological science covers such a wide area, and that's one of the things we've been talking about today in so many different dimensions, but what are sort of the key areas that you see?
Look, the key one really that, particularly when you talk about efficiency, is the role of photogrammetry. You know, the days of an archaeologist drawing each bluestone cobble and then having to draw it 4 days again later when you've exposed a bit more of the site, you know, that used to be the role of one person sort of full-time within each trench. The ability not just to record deposits, context, features more rapidly, but to be able to also do them in greater detail and to be able to now have them in a form that they can be presented in different formats in terms of site interpretation, making them available to the public. These are all great positives that we haven't had before. So the labour intensity that something like detailed photogrammetry can address is just one example, really.
And to follow up again, is that a role where you can see the university or university sector?
Absolutely. I think where the expertise is located, it's probably difficult for each relatively small scale consultancy. Ian's company is one of the largest in Melbourne, but some of the archaeology consultancies are 4 or 5 people. And I don't think it's likely that they are going to build that level of expertise in-house to be able to address those requirements in every case. So these collaborations, which we've seen already playing out between archaeology consultancies and universities, I suspect that's a far more feasible model where the consultant understands that they need to deliver more detailed analysis than what's been done before, but they go to these collaborative bodies to find the expertise. So I think that's the model. We're not going to expect all of the archaeology consultancies, of which there's about 30 in Victoria at the moment, they're not going to have the capacity to develop high-level expertise. So it's about these partnerships and collaborations with the universities.
Great, thank you. So we were talking about this intersection across all these different aspects in archaeological science. So Caroline, where do you see the role of archaeological science in your area? Either intersecting what you've already discussed or something in a different direction?
Thanks, Rachel. So I work for Wurundjeri Wurrung Cultural Heritage Aboriginal Corporation, which is established by Wurundjeri people back in the 80s, I believe, but also under the Aboriginal Heritage Act is appointed as a statutory body to manage Aboriginal cultural heritage for a large swathe of Greater Melbourne. So we have legislative processes that we have to follow and that people have to adhere to when they're doing certain types of developments, or even if they want to do research projects or something like that. People will come along, sponsors of proposed activities, we call them, say developments, will come along and talk to the elders about what they wish to do and how they might go about doing it. And they might do some background research. They might go out and do a survey, a walk around to see what's there, and some excavation. And then we'll have discussions about whether it's possible for the sponsor to conduct an activity in a way that avoids or minimises harm. And if that's not possible, we would request, for example, some salvage excavation. So every project is very different and you never know what you're going to find as well. Cultural value studies are becoming a larger component of some of these investigations as well. And I guess the place where archaeological science comes into these types of investigations is if you're talking about a research collaboration, a lot of institutions will come to the Wurundjeri elders to talk about an idea for a project that they might have. And if the elders are interested in that happening in the Wurundjeri RAP area and how the elders might see it happening in terms of the specific methods. And then there's a requirement to go through a permit application process as well. So we work through that process and then we evaluate that permit, and that includes scientific methods that might be used in the course of those investigations. So it might be things like use, wear and residue analysis of artefacts or dating a site. It could be just analysis of stone tools, portable X-ray fluorescence to try and understand the types of raw materials that are represented in stone tool assemblages and perhaps try and locate where some of those artifacts came from as well, the original source and maybe how people have moved around the landscape or traded, exchanged artifacts. And then the other side of it is with developments, so sponsor-driven activities. With salvage investigations, we're trying to make it a little bit more routine. It's a difficult situation, I guess, just quickly because, you know, obviously sponsors don't necessarily want to spend more money than they need to in the course of these cultural heritage management plans, but we are trying to make it a little bit more routine for people to go above and beyond the minimum requirements that are set out in the Aboriginal Heritage Act for the way investigations have to be conducted and see a little bit more archaeological science implemented in those investigations. To come up with a more detailed understanding of what the cultural heritage that was identified represents, including, for example, when it was left there, which is not necessarily a requirement to understand at all, which is almost a bit horrifying in a way. But for some salvage excavations now, we're trying to make that a little bit more routine to at least understand before these sites are destroyed, what's there. How did Wurundjeri people use those locations? When were they there? What were the paleo-environmental conditions like at the time? All sorts of things, really.
So it sounds like archaeological science already is happening in these types of investigations, but it sounds like it's also, like we've just spoken about with the other speakers, it's something that Wurundjeri wants to see become more routine in terms of these cultural heritage management plans.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a little bit more, a bit sort of above and beyond your classic approach, which might just be how many artifacts did you find, what raw material types were they, end of the story, to going beyond that and building a bigger, more detailed picture. And a lot of those archaeological science techniques can help build that picture.
So you mentioned a couple in there, like portable XRF and mapping and things like that. What are the key ones that you see or that you see to be expanded further?
Yeah, so I guess typically in the Wurundjeri Wrap area, what you're most likely to find is stone artifacts. So any analytical techniques that you can use to better understand stone artifacts, whether that be residue use-wear analysis, some more detailed technological analysis of the artifacts themselves, higher level statistical analysis, for example, refitting and conjoint analysis, which is a little bit of what I do, trying to piece things back together to understand how something was napped and maybe what was taken away, what was used. Portable X-ray fluorescence to understand the chemical makeup of the raw materials themselves and perhaps where those artifacts, the materials used to make those artifacts were procured from and where they were exchanged and traded. Understanding how old the deposits are that in which those artifacts are encapsulated, and understanding site formation processes. Occasionally people might find shell middens, they're a little bit rarer. We've got a rock engraving that we've been looking at Darabin Creek that we're just about to publish an article on. Rock art's a lot rare and we're in the Wurundjeri Wrap area as well. But yeah, a lot of stone tool based analysis, really, that's a skill that we don't see enough people really, coming into the industry with those skills.
So it sounds like it goes all the way from artifact the way to landscape and a lot of potential for different intersections with the university as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. So I'd like to hand over to Louise now. So either to continue this particular conversation or speak directly to where archaeological science fits into the museum sector.
Yeah, well, I can speak to the cultural collections here at the university. So, and there's a lot of overlap with what Caroline has just been saying about interrogating materials and objects that are in the collection. So the university has a number of collections. There's over 30 that fall into the cultural collections, but we're also responsible for the object part of the Donald Thompson collection. So we've got the collections here that often came together by an early academic or professor. They were teaching collections that were brought together as part of a teaching collection, a discipline. So the problem we have with many of these collections is that they're not very well provenance. They're quite lean on documentation. So I see that archaeological science has the capacity to potentialize a lot of these collections where we don't have information about where something was collected by, the materials that constitute it, just sort of, a very broad range of questions that could be put to analysis, I suppose. Secondly, the Donald Thompson collection is a very different type of collection. It was collected from 1928 through to 1965 from Cape York, Arnhem Land, and from the Gibson and Sandy Deserts. That collection is very well documented, but there's still the capacity for analysis to interrogate the materials. A lot of your work, Rachel, around ochres, that non-destructive techniques, and that would probably shed light on the trade that may have taken place with ochre that's then used on some of the artifacts that are in the collection. Also things around structure and analysis. So to me, it's a discipline that's not been highly associated yet with the collections at the university, but one that has enormous potential.
Sounds like there's a lot of opportunity there, particularly in materials analysis and artifact analysis. Yeah. So we spoke briefly, sort of touching on archaeology and salvage archaeology, which naturally is a process of destruction in many cases, fortunately or unfortunately. But in the museums and collections, the idea of destruction or sampling of artifacts is sometimes very difficult or not possible. So where do you see archaeological science in that context?
Well, I think because from what I'm learning, that because the analysis can take place without destruction of samples, that opens up a whole new sort of area of research and an opportunity to provide insights into the collections that we wouldn't otherwise sort of know. So, you know, especially with a lot of the First Nations material, that any sort of form of destruction is really not desired at all. So that in itself is a really important aspect of the discipline. So, yeah.
And do you see the main questions with that type of material, mainly characterization, you know, finding out if things are made of or provenance or something else?
All of those, really. Yeah, all of the above. Yeah.
Thank you. So thanks everyone for those answers. I'm going to change the question. So looking across all these different sectors and the intersections of all these different areas, so what should graduates in your area know about archaeological science, and what skill sets do they need? So this is looking at saying you have a recent university graduate, whether it be undergraduate all the way through to PhD. You're working with them or you're about to hire them. What are some of the things that you want them to know? So I'll start with Jeremy first.
I think from our perspective as a regulator, it's really important that the skill sets are targeted to what we do, really. We're not a team that does a lot of field work as much as I would like to be. We're more an authority that oversees the work done by other practitioners. So I think for us, it's things like data management. We're all aware that the data, the files that come through from some of the archaeological science outputs are really challenging to manage. So for us, it's about, if we're the state's overarching regulator, it's about the development of systems, really. So how are we going to manage and store and make this material accessible throughout the community? So it's a different skill set in some senses for us as a data manager, as a regulator. So that's one thing. This sort of overarching strategic view is really important for the work that we do. The other thing I think is important is that this broad understanding of the nature of archaeology in all its forms is a skill. That wonderful to have high-level technical expertise in these emerging fields. But I think the understanding of the nature of archaeology in all its forms is important as well. It's excavation, it's artifact management, it's analysis. So I think one thing to be mindful of is this need for the students to have at least a base level understanding of the process. The expertise, the technical skills is clearly going to be part of the university training. But I think the ability to understand the process of site investigation and analysis, identification, that process too is important to be able to give the students a sense of relevance where they may go. So it's possibly something, I mean, I imagine students often come to archaeological science almost in a postgrad stage of their career, perhaps with that base level understanding already in place. But one thing is not to lose sight of that need to understand the broader profession before drilling down to something perhaps more specific.
So not just for the sake of data and numbers, but the interpretation.
I think so.
Caroline?
Thank you. I think, yeah, there's a couple of different aspects. So obviously in Aboriginal cultural heritage management, which is our industry, if you're going to work as a consultant, you're probably most likely going to find stone tools out in the field. So any skills that relate to stone tool analysis or any of the other additional sort of analytical techniques I was talking about to further our understanding of those stone tools and how they came to be there and how old they are very helpful. I didn't mention before 3D modelling, photogrammetry, 3D scanning, that kind of thing. Also very handy. We've started doing that a lot more for scarred trees. So any of those extra kind of archaeological science, while maybe they're not inherently required for any sort of job in Aboriginal cultural heritage management, are also handy. So people might like to consider, you know, doing an honours year or master's research, something like that, to give them those minimum qualifications in any event to go on to be able to become a registered heritage advisor within Victoria, but also to, you know, be able to further understanding of the cultural heritage that's being identified. And then I think consultation is so important for working with an Aboriginal organisation. So experience in working with Aboriginal people, Indigenous Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is really important. And also just in consulting with a wide range of different organisations, whether it be developers who you might be their client, government agencies. We do a lot of work with Parks Victoria, Vic Roads, DELP, First People State Relations, every now and then Heritage Victoria, all sorts of different organisations where you're working on a project, but it brings in a whole lot of different people. Those sorts of skills are very important in these types of investigations as well.
I'm glad you mentioned that, talking about all these discussions with stakeholders.
And universities.
And universities, yes, we should add that as well, but the intersection of all the different groups with interests in this area. I also appreciate that you brought up the 3D modeling and some of these digital archaeology techniques, which really seem to be having a moment. And I think from what we've been seeing, it really seems to be something that's taking off in the area of archaeology. Do you mind adding to that?
Yeah, so obviously, for example, with scarred trees, there's been an increase in bushfires, extreme weather events. So they have a limited lifespan in any event. So we're trying to encourage heritage practitioners to do some more 3D modelling of them because they're very much at risk. And it's a nice way for education. It's a nice education tool for people who can't necessarily be able to improve their awareness of those site types as well. Similarly, we've done it with boomerangs. We're working on a boomerang at the moment. You can do it with stone tools. You can do it with a whole variety of things. There are specialists who have a lot of expertise in this area. One of them's here today, Brian Armstrong. We've worked together. But also there are basic apps that anybody can use just on your iPhone or tablet, Polycam being an example. So it's becoming a lot more accessible, and the benefits from creating a digital archive of something to engaging with the public are very widespread and valuable, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. Hand over to Ian.
Where do I start with this one?
What graduates?
Yeah, so I think, there's two sides to this. And Rachel, we've had discussions about familiarity amongst people in an academic environment with the statutory framework and, if you like, the consultancy environment that we swim in. I think it's a case of developing graduates that understand the avenues within which the work will be occurring. That's the statutory framework. But then also understanding the vehicles that they have to drive along those avenues. And that's understanding the techniques. And I mean, we do employ a whole variety of scientific techniques as a matter of course. We're regularly doing carbon dating or OSL for, to satisfy management plans. Our staff need to be familiar with what these things are. But there's also a sort of iterative process that they find themselves involved in, even from a quite junior level, where they're not the compliance bodies, they're not the registered Aboriginal parties or Heritage Victoria or whoever, but they are involved in the discussions and they are the people who are most familiar with the materials sometimes. And so they can be, to some extent, influencing the requirements for these methods. And we find ourselves, especially when we're working with things like cultural heritage management plans, often in a situation where it's, yes, we might not be being required to use these things as a condition, but there may be a contingency, if this, then this. And that's a situation where if this turns up, if you find a hearth, for example, then you have to start employing a whole different raft of technologies and techniques. And that's an area in which obviously the individual having a background in those areas or having an understanding of what's available, understanding the vehicles they could be driving down that pathway, that's a huge advantage. As you said, I mean, I think as Jeremy was saying, not every consultancy can have lots of specialists. We're lucky to have some specialists. My illustrious colleague Ian Osterreicher over there is a geoarchaeologist. And that enables us to identify opportunities to apply these techniques much more readily. But, by bringing rising the tide, if you like, on the background and the understanding of graduates, that is going to, increase the pressure from within the industry as much as we can. For the application of those techniques, I think.
So from what you're saying, it really sounds like it's just not necessarily the knowledge and the technical skill set, which is very important, but also the big picture question. So if people are looking at these archaeological sites for a particular situation, that you have to know the big picture, or you have to know if you are sampling, you have to take this sample first because this one might affect the sampling for this other technique.
That as well, yeah.
It's both the big picture and the technical at the same time.
Yes, exactly. And if you're in an excavation context where excavation is destruction, you don't get a second chance. So being able to understand the potential of the material that you're excavating and what techniques could be applied to it is very important, even at the, if you like, the lowliest levels of the site technician.
And also, I suppose, an element, as you say, resilience and flexibility, because you go in thinking one thing and then you excavate and then something else, and you have to pivot and take into consideration those new questions.
And confidence and familiarity improves the ability to pivot, as you say.
Yes. So I suppose that's partially what you learn in university, but partially also comes from experience working in the role.
Inevitably, yeah.
Yes. So I'm over to you, Louise. Like or conservation person.
Yeah, I'm not sure how well I can sort of answer this, but I suppose that I think that museums and collections are needing to, I suppose, I'm going to say justify their existence. And by that, I mean, that they need to sort of define their purpose. And part of that is sort of, telling stories, telling histories, providing access, all sorts of things. And I see that graduates in ArchaeoScience will be able to help tell those stories that will then help us understand our shared histories. So I think that, not knowing so much about the field myself, but just seeing that there is enormous capacity for the discipline to do the work the museums need to be doing now in terms of sort of revealing what they have and interrogating what they have in their collections and sharing that knowledge more broadly with public communities, their audiences. Yeah.
I think you bring up a really important point about the role of museums in not only looking at preservation or maintaining collections, but also in that public view in collections and communication with communities, with the broader public, which we also see in archaeological sites and archaeological sites more broadly. It has a lot of interest, and it's really important for the larger public to know about. Museums in particular play a really important role there. So perhaps that's an area we develop in terms of developing exhibitions, for instance, where you have these lovely collections over here which tell their own story, but where can we integrate archaeological science as part of an exhibition, for instance?
Yeah, very, very much so, because it's no longer can a museum just be sort of for curators hidden away in their rooms, sort of developing their own sort of projects without sort of working with communities to find to answer questions that communities want to know. And I think that revealing and the characterizations of objects and interrogating materials is very much sort of like what external audiences are interested in.
That's something actually I've been thinking a lot about, is how we, as archaeological scientists or within a university, could do that in a museum exhibition. A lot of museum exhibitions can be quite interactive. Push this button and this happens, and you have a sort of experience of how it might be done. That would be something to explore in the future.
Definitely.
Thank you. Our next question is about how can we enhance Indigenous project co-development in two-way learning, especially in project and research design. I'd like to start with Carolyn.
No worries. Obviously, it'd be great if the elders were here to talk today, but I can talk a bit about the process. I think consultation is key, early consultation. So there are requirements in any event under the Aboriginal Heritage Act to consult with traditional custodians about their cultural heritage. But if people have projects in mind, come to the elders, the Heritage Unit elders, and organise a meeting. I know there's a bit of a waiting time at the moment, so we apologise for that. It's just really busy. Or even just have some regular meetings, even if you have nothing in particular to talk about, because those meetings can also lead to some really interesting outcomes. Where the elders might mention something that they're interested in, and it might lead to something. And also maybe just thinking, if you are a cultural heritage practitioner, you're not necessarily, you were talking about you're constrained in the process, you're trying to win jobs. So there's only so much you can build in, but I guess if there is any scope to kind of move beyond the minimum requirements of the Act and incorporate some archaeological science elements into routine investigations. That would be the starting point, yeah.
And so what would some of those things to be that would go beyond routine that you've seen recently that have worked really well?
Just some of the techniques I was talking about earlier, you know, understanding how old deposits are, understanding how stone tools were perhaps used through residue and use analysis, understanding what the materials are, where they may have come from, how they might have been traded and used over time, creating 3D models of them. Some of these things are a bit more complicated and more expensive, and some of them are a bit more easily undertaken. So just thinking about how some of those things might be possible and how you can build a more detailed story from those types of investigations.
So it sounds like we go back to this idea of the integration into a bigger picture, a bigger narrative, but including everybody in that conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hand it over to Louise, please.
I think we're at a stage with the Donald Thompson collection where we're starting to think about developing a program of research. And so we are considering a lot of these sort of questions at the moment. How do we go around doing this? Who do we need to consult with? And so as a starting point with that, we have employed or we have on our team two Indigenous women from the Northern Territory, from whose family have links to Arnhem Land, and they are employed as managing community engagement. And so that's to develop the networks of relationships that we hope to have in order to carry out the research that we see in the collection, the potential research that we see in the collection. So we're very much guided by our colleagues, but also in principle, I would say that any co-developed research programs that you would want to, because a lot of the Donald Thompson collection obviously comes from communities of origin that are in Northern Territory and Queensland, so that we would need to go through the appropriate organisations, the representative organisations to conduct that research. So that is something that we are already sort of undertaking. So identifying who those organisations are, they're the corporations, the land councils, recognised Aboriginal bodies. Sometimes the art centres can be very helpful with that research, but also I think the most important thing is that we work within the parameters of the ARCIS Code of Ethics for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research, and there's 4 principles of research there, and the primary one is that the principle of Indigenous self-determination. And so I think with any co-developed projects that you have to be working with communities to establish what research that they are interested in, and then allow those communities to guide the research. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned those IATSIS Code of Ethics. I think it's a really important one for us to be thinking about and acting upon when we do archaeological science studies more broadly. Can you expand a little bit on some of the engagement that you've been doing, either for the Donald Thompson or related projects?
Yeah, well, I have to say, like, it's very early days, but with the Donald Thompson collection, between 2018 and 2019, the university conducted a review into the Donald Thompson collection. The original agreement for the collection was established in 1973, and then there was a second agreement probably 20 years later. I can't remember the exact date. But that part of the review was to look at how to potentialise the collection, both through research and, you know, like a whole range of things. But the main thing was to actually consult with the communities who had probably not been consulted with around the collection. There'd been sort of examples of communities involved, but there hadn't been a holistic approach to consultation. So I was involved in that review, and out of that review, 25 recommendations were established. So we're really sort of just at the early days now of sort of going back to the communities, starting the conversation about research, and then hopefully sort of progressing that. So it's really early days, yeah.
Thank you. And I think that's another thing to really mention how important that is. It's a conversation and can be over a very long period of time. Ian, would you like to add to that?
I suppose a lot of what I spend my time doing now, as I was saying when we were writing down bits of paper, is whilst, I talked about constraints, our world is not entirely about constraints. I spend a lot of my time now working with clients, trying to get them to understand that there are constraints, but there are also opportunities in projects. And a lot of those opportunities, if we're talking about Aboriginal cultural heritage, are working with the traditional owners and trying to get more of a narrative and a celebration of Aboriginal cultural heritage from that project. There's a few examples that I could give. In the Melbourne CBD, we worked on a project on Elizabeth Street, so just on the banks of the Williams Creek that is under Elizabeth Street still, and the development-led excavations uncovered a fairly intact, I suppose, a napping floor of Aboriginal material. And this was back before Wurundjeri were awarded RAP status. It was a few years ago, but we were able, through the requirements of the 3 Aboriginal groups that at that time were speaking for the centre of Melbourne, and little commitment from the developer, actually, to be honest, we were able to subject that site to some quite significant analysis, including residue analysis. And the residue analysis identified blood, from a number of different species. It was a contact period site, so there were Aboriginal artifacts made from glass. And just the speciation that we were able to identify, there were tiny filaments from various marine birds, an emu, I think, in the that were attached to the stone tools, and it hugely enriched the narrative and enabled a much stronger appreciation of the significance of the site. Another one, we were working for the City of Melbourne. It's often when you're working for public clients, it's easier to achieve that, identification of opportunity, or rather that assertion of opportunity or recognition of the opportunity when you're dealing with public clients than it is with the private clients. But in the renovation of South Bank Boulevard that goes behind the NGV, you're probably familiar with it, when they were reducing that from the great big trunk road that it was a few years ago to the much more pleasant sort of public thoroughfare that is now. We did some testing. We dug some very deep test trenches because it's quite heavily built up there again on the edge of the Yarra, the Boomerangs, sorry. And we found some really amazingly rich, from an environmental evidence point of view, deposits that were then used to inform the plantings along South Bank Boulevard. So we were able to identify the species that existed in that part of the area. And probably my favourite one at the moment is that, and this is really about sort of, I guess a broader comment that I would make is that increasingly, as we, if you like, plumb greater depths in the archaeological investigation or the cultural heritage investigation sort of business, we are going to increasingly need archaeological science. And one of the best examples I would give for that is that we're working a lot in the offshore environment. You've probably seen that there's 60 wind farms planned, around the coast of Australia at the moment. Whilst it's not currently the focus of investigation, Bass Strait will almost certainly be archaeologically quite similar to what's known as Doggerland, the North Sea in Europe, in that it will almost certainly be full of tangible archaeological evidence from 6,000 years ago and before that. We've done a pilot study with the Gunditjmara down in southwest Victoria, where we've been working with Gunditjmara elders to understand the values of their sea country. But also we've been working with an organisation in the UK who've got very sophisticated marine geophysical capabilities, and they're able to understand what would have been the landscape, the topography of the marine environment, so they can penetrate beneath the marine silts to understand the landscape. And so this is an area of cultural heritage that without those technologies, we wouldn't have any understanding of. And so that understanding of the tangible landscape combined with the traditional owners, so the values of sea country is really building a much stronger appreciation that then enables the management of impacts around offshore development. So, sorry, that was a big, long, rambling answer, but yes, there are lots, all the way through there, it requires partnership with the traditional owners. Yeah.
No, I'm glad, especially in that last example. I think it's a really important thing that people are beginning to recognize. I mean, it's always been there, but I think people are beginning to recognize more that it isn't just the land, it's country on land and it's sea country. And there is not necessarily a division there. It's all about the greater cultural landscape. So it's really important to be looking at these things with archaeological science, with archaeology in general, not as compartmentalized, but looking at these things holistically. Would you like to add that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously not specifically my area. The Heritage Act doesn't cover Aboriginal cultural heritage, but picking up on Ian's theme of opportunity and I think also complexity. As we get archaeology done better, particularly in Melbourne, I think we're understanding what we find and we're excavating so much more carefully and we're recording in much more detail. And that is opening up these opportunities for analysis. And I think whether it's the work that Extend have done recently on digs like Bennett's Lane, the work that Ochre have done as part of this Metro South project, working next to the Young and Jackson site. And the way that the Ochre site was excavated, where I think it was 470 Aboriginal stone tools were found. To me, what we're seeing is this emerging sense of the landscape of Melbourne in all of its times, really. The sense that the Aboriginal layer stops and you get the historic on top is just not being borne out by the archaeology. That, to me, one of the great findings out of this, the Metro South, was this sense that this little high point of land overlooking the Boomerang, overlooking the Yarra, was always important to people. It was elevated land. The little pathways that were found certainly predate Batman's arrival there. And we've got something that's a very human story here, and it's reflected in the archaeology. And it's only now really where these sites can be investigated and recorded in a much better way than they were sort of 10 years ago. Ian cited Bennett's Lane. We've now got this sense of the rear yard of properties established in the late 1830s, 1840s. You've got a few very basic structures. You've got animals tethered to a post in the backyard, and the footprints, their hoof prints are preserved in the archaeological record. We've got little rivulets running through the land. We've possibly even got a small waterfall or a cascade. And what you get is this late 1830 landscape that is churned over. It's got a depth of 30 centimetres or more. The Aboriginal heritage is there, the historic is there, but they're all mixed through together. This is muddy, waterlogged land. And it's complex archaeology, but it's a really engaging story. I mean, this is also the archaeology of conflict and dispossession as well. So there's a lot of nuance to this, but archaeological science is absolutely the key. That these stories warrant really detailed investigation now. They've been excavated well, but they've been recorded well. But making sense of the samples, the residues, the artifacts, the deposits, the natural elements is where we get the richness that really we should be returning to the public. My last point, Ian said, yes, archaeology is destructive, and it absolutely is. So the ability to return the information in various ways, whether it's through virtual reality reconstruction, whether it's going into the exhibit and seeing the artifacts, but also getting the fly-through photography, a really added dimension to the understanding of the site. That's the next generation of the display of archaeology. Yeah, we might have lost the fabric, but to some degree, we're now getting this window of opportunity to actually retain that and represent that in different ways that we haven't had before.
Thank you. I think that actually summarizes many of these things very well. So I will add to that. Thank you very much. So that's our list of set questions. At this point, I'd like to open it up to the participants, both in person and online. And I'd like to start first with any students or early career researchers to start the leading question. Okay, so none in person. Do we have any online, Amber? Pretty online, yeah. So okay, so maybe we'll start with the online question.
Major changes in the sector within the last 5 years.
Okay, so I'll just repeat the question. So the question was about what are some of the major changes in the sector over the last 5 years? So maybe I'll start with Jeremy.
Yeah, perhaps one answer to that is LiDAR, really. Like 5 years ago is a really interesting time frame. I suspect we first started using it at Heritage Victoria, working with Matty Miller, looking at Narra Warren site, police camp and the Dandenongs. And it was really basic stuff. We got access to the LiDAR. We knew there'd been buildings there historically. And we were interrogating the LiDAR, trying to see whether we could see shapes, formations in the landscape. There were potentially burial sites there as well as building structures. And then we went out there to do the ground proofing and see whether the funny little indications we could see were verified to some degree on the surface of the land. But we weren't particularly successful. And I suspect the key was that the quality of the LiDAR at that time just didn't really allow it. Move forward 5 years, we're now looking at detailed LiDAR. Certainly we're dealing with the Buckland Valley up in the Alpine region at the moment. I'm aware of really detailed work being done at Budgebim. And I think the doors that are opening up now for the use of that technology to locate site location, site extent, site detail, even some preliminary discussions happening now about the development of artificial intelligence to tell us what the signature of a gold puddler in the goldfields or a small stone building in the Alpine region or another mining relic, what might that look like within a set of data from a LiDAR product? So I think that's a real progression now, this ability to learn about site detail. The on-site process then is one of verification rather than identification. So that's got incredible implications for site protection and for knowledge of place.
Thank you. Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Jeremy. So many changes and obviously technological changes, and another one probably being 3D modelling, photogrammetry, and just how that technology is rapidly changing and how it's becoming a lot more accessible to create these models and interact with them. But perhaps, I guess, a couple of things, Juukan Gorge and Black Lives Matter. I think there's been a real, since 2020, a lot of people were horrified by what happened with Juukan Gorge, and it was a terrible thing that happened. But one positive thing that's come out of it is an increase in awareness of an appreciation of Aboriginal cultural heritage. And at Wurundjeri Corporation, we're seeing a lot more people who want to proactively engage with us now. Very early on in, for example, for major infrastructure projects, a lot of Victorian government agencies, but also developers who want to do large residential subdivisions, essentially new suburbs almost, where they're putting in hundreds, if not thousands of new homes. A lot of people coming to us, whether it be risk management, I guess, or just genuinely wanting to be proactive and talk to the elders. I think I've seen a lot more, an increase for the better in that regard, and perhaps following on from that, a little bit more interest and willingness in paying for some of the techniques that we've discussed today.
Yeah, two answers. So firstly, as Caroline was saying, the context that we're working in is changing dramatically in the Aboriginal heritage space, but also, in the consultancy world, we're often responding to the market, the development industry. The last few years in Melbourne, it's been all guns blazing. You can see from the number of cranes on the horizon just how much development work is occurring. There is, I'm sure Meg would agree with me, there's a lot of pressure on companies in the consultancy space to do a lot of work, and there aren't enough archaeologists out there at the moment. But at the same time, that enables us to better resource projects because there is so much demand. And therefore, within that better resource project, we can look at employing techniques that perhaps we couldn't previously. Then the other answer that I would give is probably just digital recording in the broader sense. Things like being able to record our historical archaeological excavations digitally, recording, in a way which is GIS enabled, so that you can manipulate the data much more efficiently, much more accurately, tell a much richer story. The built heritage team going out doing surveys, municipal surveys of heritage fabric, built fabric across various parts of Melbourne or Sydney or Brisbane. We're doing it now digitally so that the data can be uploaded to the council's own repositories and to our sort of project repositories in real time. All of that is it creates efficiencies, but it also enriches the product.
I suppose in the museums sector, and especially sort of in the Aboriginal cultural heritage sector in museums, that in the last 5 years, there's been, you know, a much greater shift in attitude and an understanding that we are custodians of collections and that we hold them in care for Aboriginal people. And part of that responsibility is to help interrogate the collections and using the available new technologies has been an incredible sort of enhancement to that project. So especially around, there's been some 3D imaging of the Donald Thompson collection and those images of them being taken out to community when it's not possible to bring communities in. So that's been sort of, you know, a huge technological change. GPS mapping so that you can actually sort of take objects through databases back to their original place of collection. So I suppose a great collision of technology, history and development of access around the collections has been one of the greatest changes, and a change in attitudes around the fact that, you know, museums probably do have all been under a process of attempting to decolonize their spaces and are actively working towards that.
All very important points. Thank you. So we have time for a very quick question from the in-person audience. Okay, then we'll change over to a very brief question from the online audience.
Actually, not a quick question. The agencies and like with regards to two-way learning in the field of archaeological science, the scientific understanding seems to be informed by Indigenous knowledge and sensitive findings. We environments do not necessarily placing activities to the landscape without coming together and sharing. So much like the capacity thought with the different ways of performing legislative instead of defense reports, elements that will share, rumors of whether conflicts, etc. So ideas for two-way learning and sharing the works that we know.
Okay, that was a very long question.
Yeah.
So I think I'll yeah, so I think the question is getting at two-way learning as well as two-way communication around archaeological science and excavation. So it's not only looking at it in one particular way or one particular way of presenting, but integrating different knowledges into archaeological science. So maybe I'll hand that over to you, Caroline. Very briefly, yes.
Okay.
Louise as well.
And we should mention as well that Birgitta was involved in the study that Ian was talking about on Elizabeth Street. So hello, Birgitta, and thank you for that amazing work that you did and do. Yes, just very quickly, two-way learning is very important, as Birgitta says. And I guess just as an example at Wurundjeri, I mentioned earlier that cultural values studies are becoming more routinely employed with cultural heritage assessments. So that means people going out and actually talking to elders, taking them out on country to talk about traditional cultural values or Indigenous knowledge that they wish to share for a project. So in the archaeological context, that means that you have both sides of the story. You have, you know, the results of scientific analysis of some artifacts, but also traditional cultural knowledge that can be embedded, enmeshed with that as well. Our NARAP unit at Wurundjeri, they do a lot of country land management. So they use a lot of their traditional knowledge when it comes to revegetation schemes and fire, traditional cultural burning as well. We had a project, a very successful project with DELP, the Jacksons Creek Regional Parklands Cultural Values Study. So that's had a few different components. It involved a cultural values study where a lot of the Wurundjeri elders went out and walked different parts of that area that's proposed to become regional parklands. It's a Victorian government election commitment. But also there are a number of archaeological assessments that are coming out of that as well. So excavation of Holly Green Mound, a mound in Sunbury that we don't know much about at the moment, but it's going to be excavated and dated and micromorphology samples collected so we can work out how it formed and what exactly is in the sediments, if there are actually Aboriginal ancestral remains there. So it's gone through a permit process as well. People are probably familiar with the Sunbury rings, but there's going to be some excavation as well of that. And I'm currently looking at the stone artifacts that come from there. But again, the elders have gone out and shared information. That's all gone into a report that Wurundjeri has control of. But the idea is to have two-way knowledge, two-way learning, and create a report that Wurundjeri controls and has contributed to, and contains lots of different perspectives, including this, so combining scientific and traditional cultural knowledge.
Great, thank you very much. And that essentially wraps our session. So I really want to sort of take the big picture and really look at how large archaeological science is in terms of scope. We've talked about many different areas and many different aspects. And we really look forward to all of these different areas intersecting and being part of this larger collaborative future. So again, I'd like to thank our panelists again, and thank you very much for their time and insight and expertise in this area. Thank you.